Hi, my name is Dan. I'm an instructor with UTD, and today I'm going to take you through a quick conversation about manifolds. So we'll be discussing a little bit in depth some of the motivations behind the manifolding, whether it be in one way or another. Some of the reasons that I want to do this video and share it with you is because I've met quite a few divers now who are diving around in a double manifolded back mount configuration without knowing why at all. And also having this conversation really highlights some of the motivations and gives a lot of insight into why you utilize and why use one or another way of manifolded configurations. So I think it's something that's really interesting to tinker about with. Right, some of the things that I think we need to talk about first is the probability of a failure versus the consequence of a failure. I think it's very important to distinguish those two to get a baseline of understanding or a framework of understanding for us to continue on. So we'll be discussing that first. Then we'll be talking a little bit about why we manifold in the first place. What is our motivation? What are the pros and the cons, and what are we hoping to achieve here? Then we'll continue talking a little bit about high pressure manifolds and low pressure manifolds, what the differences are, what the pros and the cons are of each, and when they work really well. And then naturally we'll continue onwards into talking a little bit about back mount and side mount and how all of the above plays into all of that. So that's a good conversation to have, I think. Starting out with the probability versus the consequence of a failure, those are two vastly different things. And I think that it's very important to distinguish them accordingly, because something might be very probable or it happens all the time, but it's not really a problem. It has no consequence to the dive. Whereas something might be very rare, but if it does happen, it could be catastrophical. So what's really determining my approach, my motivations here is the consequence of a failure, not the likelihood. So something might be very unlikely, and I'll want to be very sure that I have a solution to it, preferably a consistent solution, so that it's something that I can use a response model that will work for many different failures. That would be the ideal, obviously, because then I'll have to learn less protocol and I'll be able to recycle as much as I can, which is really good for learning and application, of course. So that's a little bit on the differentiation between probability and consequence of failure. Very important to keep this in mind. Touching on why we want to manifold in the first place is also something that I think is quite interesting, because what we want to do is have a redundancy, but it's not just about the gear, is it? It's also about how we interact with that gear. So we want to be able to make sure that our way of operating or working that equipment, our protocol, all of this stuff is consistent as well. So it's not just about, when I say consistency and redundancy, it's not just a gear specific thing. The gear just facilitates that. So a good example could be the gas share or the air share, if you will. We want to have a consistent protocol for that, but what I want from the equipment in terms of consistency and redundancy is not just to have two different places to get my gas. It's also to have it configured in a way where I can use just one gas share protocol to cover all of my needs, right? And that's something that's a part of the motivation as well. And then there's the compartmentalization aspect of it as well, right? I don't want a lot of stuff to start falling together like a cart house if one little thing goes wrong, right? So one little O-ring, I want to be able to separate as much as possible from a lot of the other stuff, right? So I can have my system and I can have one tank, I can have another tank. I want to be able to compartmentalize so that I can isolate and manage any failure somewhere in that system landscape. So that's the compartmentalization aspect of it, or that it meshes with the redundancy aspect, of course. Now, taking this and going into the perspectives on high pressure and low pressure manifolding, the high pressure manifold is pretty smart because it allows me to treat all of my gas as one unit, so long as it's connected. But therein also lies the limitation, because I can't connect any more tanks. I can't work physically up against a 200 bar connection, hence that's the problem. The high pressure workload is too much for me to physically handle. So I can't add a third tank to it, or scale it down to just one tank if I'm going on a more shallow dive. And that's the limitation of a high pressure manifold connection. And you can have them in different ways. You can have a hard connection, that'll be the one that you see in the Hogarthian setup, where you've got a bridge between the two tanks, or you can have it as a soft connection instead, where it's more of it's a hose. But they have that in common. You can't scale it the same way that you can a low pressure connection. On the other hand, the low pressure connection won't feasibly let you treat all of the gas that you have as one cohesive unit, so it'll be more compartmentalized. So that's a little bit on the pros and cons of those two, high pressure and low pressure manifolding. Now, how does this work in terms of back mount and side mount? You see, when we're diving on the traditional Hogarthian configuration, 2 tanks with a high pressure manifold, we can't take out one tank and replace it with another anyway, because it's bolted down. So the downside of a manifold that is high pressure, a high pressure manifold, in that case, don't matter anyway. So we might as well take on the benefit of being able to get both tank contents from just one source, because we're not going to be able to swap tanks around anyway, so it's not going to be scalable from that perspective. We have 2 tanks, that's it. If we want more tanks, we'll have to come up with a new system to bring it, and we can do that. It's not, I'm not saying that's a huge problem, I'm just saying we're not going to be able to use that same base anymore. Whereas in side mount, you have a flexible situation, you have a scalable amount of tanks. You can bring 1 tank, 2 tanks, 10 tanks if you want. So for me to abandon that scalability to be able to access all of them at once, or 2 of them at once, makes less sense. Or at least it's a different scenario, so I'll need to evaluate on a different basis. And that's why I'm prone to, I want to have a consistent solution that allows consistent protocol while it's scalable, and I don't need, in the face of that, I don't need to be able to access both tanks at once, and that's why I use a low pressure connection in side mount. That's me. Personally, technically at this point in time, it is possible to get them balanced out, but it's a bit tricky. I think that's something that we'll see in the future, but at present I'm okay with opening and closing a tank. I think that'll work out. So that's a little bit about back mount and side mount. It's a little bit about high pressure and low pressure manifolds. We've talked a little bit about probability and consequence of failure, which is an important distinction to make. We've spoken about why we manifold in the first place, and I hope that you've been able to take something away from this quick conversation. If you're interested in hearing more, please do get in touch. Write a comment below if you want. Feel free to follow our videos, and thanks very much for watching and your time, and safe diving.